things that are working at very slow time scales. So evolutionary processes, it isn't like evolution's down there and we're no longer having any part of it. We're all processes of evolution in the moment. It's working very slowly. But it has a part of our experience, and it's operating at a very slow time scale. We may also have at very slow time scales things like cultural and linguistic kinds of histories and the history of the language evolving. That's a slower time scale. We have a slightly faster one, some of our personal histories having to do with things like our physiologies, our cognitive structures, or things we know about language, our experiences of language, our social interactions. Then we have our very past specific experience with other people when we've interacted with them and like talked with them. And then at a faster time scale, we have things like what is the present social cultural situation that we're in right now, having to answer a question about the time or make an indirect request. What is my present bodily experience? And that's going to shape the things we do and say and how we think about it. What was the discourse that just happened? That's a very faster kind of time scale. What are my present thoughts, my desires, my intentions? That's happening at a different kind of time scale. Then we have these very fast kinds of unconscious cognitive activities, which are very rich, and they're happening below our conscious awareness that are very important in constraining the behaviors we engage in. And then perhaps at the fastest time scales are things like neural activity. And my point here is that all of these things are shaping what we do and what we experience in the moment. And so when we think about doing pragmatics, you got to think about all of these things and how they interact to produce emergent kinds of behaviors. So all of these things, again, operate at different time scales, but they're nested. They're all coupled with one another in interesting, complex, and non-linear ways. And so this is one of the things about the self-organizing principle or principles. It does away with the notion that the mind and behavior is a set of linear components. You have to understand the non-linearities that arise from the way that these different levels in the hierarchies of our experience interact with one another. Most specifically, the interactions between all of these things produce emergent, unique pragmatic behaviors that are, I suggest to you, are self-governed and are specific to the very moments of speaking or listening in context. No one force, no single variable, even the ones that you're interested in studying in your linguistic analysis or your psychological experiments, are controlling the system. It is a property of all of these things interacting with one another. So to give you just an example of these things at different levels, there's an evolutionary force that people in evolutionary psychology have suggested that we have these desires to be aware of people cheating us in social exchanges. This is a long-time evolutionary kind of bias that may, in fact, have influences upon what we do right now when we speak and interact with one another and making, for example, the transactions of goods and indirect requests. There are cultural forces that are working at a slow time scale that may, for example, guide us or constrain us to speak indirectly in some situations. We again have instances of two speakers having past joint experiences that prompt them, because of their past experiences in interacting with one another, to use certain kinds of words. There are present bodily states or positions that actually constrain memory retrieval. The fact that I am standing up, for instance, and there's studies that show this, is likely to make me more likely to be able to access positive memories and knowledge than, in fact, if I lie down or I put myself in a different uncomfortable bodily position. So that's going to have an influence in some level in terms of what I do, what I say, or how I understand. Our present thoughts, our present mental preoccupations are going to influence and push us in slight ways toward whether or not we're going to act egocentrically or cooperatively. If I'm stressed out and I'm thinking about something and some stupid person comes up and asks me for the time, I may, because I'm under this cognitive load, act more egocentrically in this particular moment, a specific, unique, pragmatic context than, in fact, if I were less under cognitive load. And then there's a whole bunch of, again, unconscious cognitive factors that shape our speed of processing. And then, again, there's a lot of things happening at the fast time scale, neural activity, and there's differences there that affect our different kinds of effective responses to situations and our ability to draw inferences and so forth. Here is a two-dimensional, horribly simplistic idea of what happens in a dynamical system, as these things are called, when self-organization processes are working. So we have these constraints that have arisen from our past experience and all these different time levels. Over here is one of these kinds of attractors, some regularity from our experience, things that arise from our evolution, or the fact that someone just said something to me and used certain kinds of words. And here is another kind of attractor, maybe from a different kind of level, working at a different time scale. As we're experiencing things, we can think of ourselves as kind of a trajectory through this state of space. And the point here is that where we go and how we situate ourselves and what we experience is shaped by the interaction of all of these factors that are pushing us in these directions. So it's the case that we're influenced by multiple factors at any one point. And these can work in small ways, sometimes large ways, probabilistically and partly, and a lot of our experience is in between, is indeterminate. So it isn't as if we're following exactly some rule, a cognitive rule, or some pragmatic rule, and that's doing what we're making us speak or think in a particular way. But rather, it's shaped by a configuration of different kinds of influences. And these kinds of graphs or charts here are ways of thinking about how experience in thinking and language use, in fact, goes through these kinds of trajectories. And can be thought of as trajectories as motivated and constrained by these multiple kinds of influences. This is an example from physics, but this is an example of what an attractor space could look like. This is a topographical kind of idealization of one particular attractor space. So it has our experiences, the knowledge that we have, can have these really bizarre, unique properties. And so as we're experiencing things in the moment, this thing can exert these forces on us in these really subtle, interesting ways that shape our behavior. So it's wild, it's crazy. It's kind of very, this is how we get the nuanced behaviors that I think we have. Ones that are specifically and always context sensitive. Here's an advantage, one that I think is very useful in thinking about cognition and pragmatics from a self-organized perspective. It turns out that we know that self-organization is not just something that happens in individual minds, but it happens collectively. Lots of social psychological experiments, for example, show that if you get a group of people together and you put them in a room, they actually self-organize and they do things and they engage in certain kinds of behaviors that makes them look like termites building nests. Right? So they do these things, emergent properties happen. But in terms of things like other interpersonal interactions, people engage in these kinds of pragmatic couplings. These are not intentional behaviors, they're things that just happen. And they happen because of these self-organization processes. So people's eye movements start coordinating. We speak in some context, and our eye movements will begin to coordinate to some significant degree. Our body postures start coordinating. Our gestures, we start gesturing similarly to one another. Our laughters begin to exhibit the same pattern and rhythm. Our lexical choices become slightly more constrained and similar to one another. The syntax we use becomes more similar. The prosody that we use, the intonational patterns we use, becomes more similar. And these kinds of couplings are really the essence of what pragmatics is. Pragmatics is not just simply us spitting out a bunch of words. The words we use in part are just simply one part of a big behavioral embodied system interacting with others to help us solve different kinds of adaptive problems in the moment. So after this talk, we're going to walk out of here, and there are these two doors at the back. And it's impossible for all of us to get through those doors at the same time. So we're going to do things like, oh, excuse me, after you, or I'm going to gesture and I'll stand back with my posture, I'll go, get out of my way. We'll do various things using our language and our bodies to solve the adaptive problem, getting all of us out of the room through these two doors. It's a pragmatic problem. Language interacting with the body is how we solve it. And so the thing about the self-organizing processes is I think it accounts for these kinds of couplings, which is really the essence, again, I think, of what pragmatic behavior is. The argument is that these kinds of stabilities that emerge through interactions are things that cannot be reduced and explained by separate kinds of motor or linguistic systems. These things are not modules. These are things that arise, again, from the interplay of brains, bodies, and environments as context-sensitive systems. So every moment of our experience, when you're in an experiment, when you're answering questions about the time, when you're walking out and trying to get out of here at the end, we are each a little dynamical system that's perfectly in tune. And we may not always be completely adaptive, but we're a function of all of these constraints that are working on us at any one moment. And so you want to think of us as pragmatic machines that are self-organized. So my conclusion here then is that to some degree it's interesting to think about various pragmatic phenomena. I haven't described any particular pragmatic principles through self-organization here, but I wanted to suggest to you that we have to be careful in the kinds of assumptions and conclusions we sometimes make from the study of pragmatics. I think it's interesting to consider the idea that a lot of pragmatic phenomena are products of self-organizing patterns and systems. And this captures, I think, a lot of people's very unique, context-sensitive kinds of pragmatic behaviors. And again, it's a kind of approach that in the same system captures moments of stability, regularity in our behaviors, at the same time shows how variability can emerge in particular moments given certain configurations of the interactions of these various components. This perspective does not reduce different behaviors to individual modules or separate mental components. It probably acknowledges, I think, that pragmatics is really a fully embodied kind of thing, again arising from the interactions of brains, bodies, and world. To some extent, some people who are embracing this view think of it as radical, embodied contextualism. And that's the way that I think it is. The issue that I raised at the beginning about how are we going to be able to find a theory of pragmatics that explain all the different variations in people's behaviors, at the same time, the regularities across different cultures, specific situations, individual histories. Again, I think this possibly unites some of this tension in the study of pragmatics because of it, thinking of it in terms of self-organizing. I don't think that my suggesting that this is something to think about necessarily means that any of you need to go out and do self-organizing systems theory work or modeling. They usually basically try to get a large bunch of data and they try to model that data and show how the behaviors in the data are reflective of these different kinds of self-organizing patterns and nonlinear systems. And I'm not saying we need to do that, but I think it is possible that we need to sort of be very wary about the implications we make from our empirical findings that we gather. That is to say, when we get some kind of pragmatic behavior, we shouldn't necessarily say that has to be